Well, for more on this, let's speak to Sami Hamdi, who is the editor-in-chief of the International Interest. He's joining us from London. Sami, good to speak with you. So, Yair Lapid is in Morocco now. How do you think ordinary Moroccans will be seeing this visit?
I think they will be very angry, but there's not much that they can do about it. I think it's important to stress that the Moroccans tied the normalization of ties with Israel with an issue that's very close to the heart of all Moroccans, which is the Western Sahara, which is something that most Moroccans agree upon. So there was also almost this sort of, yes, we normalize ties, that's really bad, but I also think that the attitude of the Moroccans is also the reason why it's taken so long for Yair Lapid to actually go to Morocco. This idea that the Israeli diplomatic mission was unable to find premises, its staff were unable to find places to rent because Moroccans were denying them that. No Moroccan wanted to rent out their properties to the Israeli diplomatic staff. And I think that's one of the reasons why Yair Lapid has taken so long, as the Israeli diplomatic mission has tried to find some way to navigate these Moroccan sensitivities. So Moroccans are not happy about it, but there's little they can do about it.
I mean, you mentioned the Western Sahara. That was the quid pro quo in this signing of this deal with Morocco and Israel. But the overall Abraham Accords were really about trade and about tourism and profit for these countries ahead of the Palestinian interest. I mean, is that a tenable position for these nations to hold, do you think?
I think it's important to stress that while this is predominantly the case with the UAE, it's not necessarily so with Morocco. And I think the second reason for the delay in Yair Lapid's visit to Morocco was that in Rabat, the Moroccan government want to see actual tangible benefits with regards to the Western Sahara before they engage in really cementing these ties with the Israelis. And indeed, they were waiting for a declaration from Biden first before they would receive the Israeli diplomatic mission or receive the Israeli foreign minister. They wanted to make sure that Biden would affirm Trump's deal to recognize Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara. And all of the talk about the tourism and bilateral trade and the ties, the reality is that while it is the primary aspect for the UAE, it is secondary for the Moroccans. And I think this is where perhaps Israel is going to find it very difficult with Morocco, in that Biden is trying to balance between Algeria and between Morocco, and he needs both on board if he wants to pursue the goals that he's pursuing in North Africa, i.e. pushing back Russia and containing a Turkish expansion of influence. But the reality is that the Moroccans are now really pressing both Israel and Biden to produce those tangible benefits, going even so far as to provoke Algeria in the UN by waving a map that suggests that Western Algeria belongs to Morocco. And this is why I think that when it comes to the Palestinian front, the reality is that for the Moroccans and for the UAE and the like, they are propagating this narrative that they are going to use these relations for the sake of the Israelis. But when we look at the demolition of homes in Silwan, when we look at the demolition of homes, the seizing of homes in Sheikh Jarrah, when we look at the continued persecution of the Palestinians, when we look at the last Israeli aggression against the Palestinians, it's abundantly clear that neither Morocco nor the UAE or anyone has any influence over Tel Aviv, because this does not have any bearing whatsoever on their relationship. It's uniquely quid pro quo. If Israel managed to deliver the Western Sahara to Morocco, this normalization will survive. If it doesn't, then Morocco, just as it did in 2000s, can easily turn back as it did before.
Yeah, and perhaps that will happen. Just lay out for our viewers, those who don't know, how important the Western Sahara is to Morocco and why.
Very briefly, Morocco believes that it was shortchanged when it secured its independence and it did not receive its full territorial integrity. And it believes that the Western Sahara historically belongs to Morocco, as do certain parts of Western Algeria. And that's why in the 1960s, the Moroccans launched the Harb al-Rimal, or the War of the Sands, in Western Algeria in order to try to take some of that territory. And it's very keen to restore what it sees as Greater Morocco, as how it existed in the past. So for them, they see it as a historical wrong that was inflicted on them by the colonial powers. The problem for the Moroccans, of course, is the inhabitants of the Western Sahara are trying to pursue their own independence, and Algeria is supporting their bid for presenting the debate for independence, not independence, but presenting the legitimacy of their case for independence, which has Morocco so exceptionally angry with the Algerians because they don't want to entertain this debate at all as to whether Western Sahara warrants an independent state. So for the Moroccans and Moroccan population generally, not just the government, this is an old wound, a very deep wound that all Moroccans believe should be rectified, and they're finding great difficulty to do so, even though they control 80% de facto.
Absolutely right. Okay, excellent stuff. Sami Hamdi from the International Interest. Appreciate your analysis, sir. Thank you for being with us.